I'm too young to handle this." The 19-year-old giant, mail-order bride, sobbed to the 70-year-old rancher who'd bought her, but by morning she was begging him never to stop. The 19-year-old mail-order bride knelt in the dusty Montana soil before the 70-year-old rancher who'd bought her, her trembling hands reaching for his belt as the morning sun cast long shadows across the isolated ranch. Aurelia May Winters, in her white wedding dress, dark eyes lifted to meet the weathered face of Josiah Bear Thornton, the giant who now owned her by law and contract. "I'm too young to handle this," she'd sobbed just hours before, backing away from him in their wedding night bedroom, her whole body shaking with the crushing weight of what she'd become. Purchased property, a transaction, a 19-year-old girl sold to a 70-year-old stranger whose calloused hands and battle-scarred body terrified her. The rancher had stood there in the lamplight, his jaw clenched tight as he watched her panic, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the room. But instead of taking what the $300 contract had promised him, instead of claiming the rights he'd paid for, Josiah Thornton had turned away and walked out into the cold Montana night, leaving her alone. But to understand how she'd ended up on her knees begging this man for something she couldn't name, you had to go back 12 hours, back to when the stagecoach had first rattled up that dusty road carrying a terrified girl who'd sold herself to escape a fate worse than death. Aurelia had pressed her face against the coach window, watching the Montana wilderness roll past, endless plains of golden grass, mountains that scraped the sky, and not a single soul for miles. Her stomach had twisted with every mile that took her farther from Missouri, farther from everything she'd known. The other passengers had stared at her Mexican features, her olive skin and dark hair, whispering behind their hands. She'd clutched the marriage contract in her lap, the paper that had cost her everything and promised her nothing except survival. The loan shark back in Missouri had given her two choices after her father drank himself to death and left her with debts she could never pay. Work in his brothel servicing miners and railroad men until her body gave out, or sign the mail-order bride contract and disappear into the frontier. She'd chosen the contract, choosing one man over hundreds, choosing Montana over slow destruction. But as the stagecoach pulled up to the Thornton Ranch and she saw him for the first time, this mountain of a man with silver hair and shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, terror had seized her heart. He was 70 years old enough to be her grandfather, old enough to have fought in wars she'd only heard stories about. Josiah had stood on the porch of his ranch house, absolutely still, watching her climb down from the coach with her single worn trunk. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, deep set in a face carved by decades of sun and wind, and something darker. Scars ran along his jaw and disappeared into his collar. His hands, massive and scarred, had hung at his sides like weapons he'd forgotten how to use. When he'd spoken, his voice had been rough as gravel. "Miss Winters, I'm Josiah Thornton. Welcome to your new home." Not a question, not a greeting, a statement of ownership. The preacher from Redemption Ridge had married them right there in the dirt yard. No ceremony, no music, just words spoken over the wind while ranch hands watched from the corral. Aurelia had felt their eyes on her, judging, calculating what this Mexican girl was worth to their boss. When Josiah had slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, too large, spinning loose, she'd wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go, no family, no money, no home but this. The preacher had said, "You may kiss your bride," and Josiah had hesitated, then pressed his lips to her forehead like she was something fragile he was afraid to break. That tenderness had confused her more than violence would have. Dinner had been silent, just the two of them at opposite ends of a long wooden table. Aurelia had pushed food around her plate, unable to eat, unable to look at him. The house was beautiful in a rough way. Hand-hewn log, stone fireplace, fur rugs on the floor. Everything built by his hands over 40 years alone. She'd felt the weight of that loneliness pressing down on the rooms like a physical thing. When darkness fell and he'd stood, extending his hand to lead her to the bedroom, her whole body had started shaking. This was it. This was the moment she'd been sold for. The bedroom had been simple. A massive bed covered in quilts, a window looking out at mountains turned purple in the twilight, a lamp casting golden light across rough wooden walls. Josiah had closed the door behind them, and the sound of it shutting had felt like a coffin lid slamming. He'd started unbuttoning his shirt, and that's when she'd seen them, the scars. They covered his chest and arms like a roadmap of violence, bullet holes, knife wounds, a brand mark burned into his ribs that looked like it had been done with a hot iron. She'd gasped, covering her mouth, and something in his eyes had died. "I know what I look like," he had said quietly, his fingers freezing on the buttons. "I know what you see. An old man. A monster. Someone who bought you because no woman would have him otherwise." His voice had cracked. "But I paid for you fair and square. The contract says, I'm too young to handle this." The words had burst from Aurelia's throat like a scream, tears streaming down her face. "I'm 19 years old, and I'm standing here like cattle you purchased, and I can't just..." She'd backed against the wall, her whole body trembling. "You don't know me. You don't love me. I'm just a thing you bought to cook your meals and warm your bed, and I can't..." "Breathe. I can't do this. I'm too young to give up every dream I ever had." She'd slid down the wall, sobbing into her hands, everything pouring out. Her father's death, the debts, the loan shark's hands on her face, telling her how pretty she'd look in his brothel, the desperate choice to sign away her life to a stranger. "I'm not even a person anymore," she'd whispered. "I'm just property, just a Mexican girl nobody wanted who got sold to an old man nobody wants." Josiah had stood there frozen, his shirt half unbuttoned, his scarred chest exposed, his face working through emotions she couldn't name. Then he'd done something that stopped her breath. He'd buttoned his shirt back up, walked to the closet, pulled out a blanket and pillow. "You're wrong about one thing," he'd said, his voice thick. "You're not property. You're a person who deserves better than this, better than me." He'd walked to the door. "This is your room tonight. I'll sleep in the barn." "But the contract..." "To hell with the contract!" He'd looked back at her, and in his storm-gray eyes, she'd seen something that made her chest ache. "I bought you because I'm a selfish old fool who couldn't stand one more night alone in this house, but I won't compound that sin by taking something you're not ready to give. Sleep. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." He'd walked out, closing the door gently behind him. Aurelia had sat there on the floor, stunned, listening to his heavy footsteps cross the porch and fade toward the barn. Then she'd heard other sounds, the creak of the barn door, the scrape of something being dragged, and then, cutting through the Montana night, a sound that shattered every wall she'd built around her heart, the deep broken sobs of a 70-year-old man who'd spent 40 years alone, who'd paid $300 for companionship, and who'd just walked away from the only warmth he'd purchased because he couldn't bear to see her cry. Aurelia had lain in that bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds from the barn that haunted her like ghosts. The rhythmic scrape of metal on wood, steady, determined, despite the cold that must have been seeping into his old bones. Every few minutes the scraping would stop, and she'd hear a sharp intake of breath, a low groan that told her his hands were hurting, that whatever he was doing was costing him pain. And beneath it all, every so often, she'd hear it again. That quiet weeping, so soft he probably thought the distance and darkness would hide it. She'd pulled the quilts up to her chin, feeling the warmth he'd given up to sleep in the freezing barn. The bed smelled like cedar and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her chest tight. This was supposed to be their wedding night. She was supposed to be lying here terrified while he took what he'd paid for. Instead, she was alone, safe, listening to him suffer in the cold because he'd chosen her dignity over his own comfort. It made no sense. Men didn't do that. Her father had sold her to pay his debts. The loan shark had tried to force her into prostitution. The stagecoach driver had touched her waist too familiarly when helping her down. Every man she'd ever known had taken what he wanted without asking. But Josiah Thornton had walked away. Around midnight, unable to bear it anymore, Aurelia had risen and crept to the window. The barn was just a dark shape against the star-filled sky, but lamplight glowed through the cracks in the walls. She could see his shadow moving inside, bent over something, working with an intensity that made her throat tight. What was he doing out there? What could be so important that he'd carve wood in the freezing darkness instead of sleeping? The next sound had nearly broken her. His voice, so quiet she almost missed it, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. Then she'd realized. He was praying. This giant of a man, this scarred rancher who looked like he could break her in half with those massive hands, was on his knees in a freezing barn, praying. She'd pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and cried silently, not understanding the emotions tearing through her chest. When dawn finally came, painting the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold, Aurelia had risen and dressed in her wedding gown, the only nice thing she owned. Her hands had shaken as she'd braided her dark hair, secured it with the small silver comb her mother had left her. She'd looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the girl staring back. 24 hours ago, she'd been property being shipped west. Now she was a wife who'd spent her wedding night alone while her husband carved wood in the cold and wept for reasons she didn't understand. She'd walked across the yard as the sun broke over the mountains, her white dress catching the golden light, the frost crunching under her feet. The barn door stood slightly ajar. She'd pushed it open slowly, not sure what she'd find. The smell hit her first, fresh-cut cedar, lamp oil, and underneath it the scent of him, earthy and real. Then she'd seen him. Josiah sat on a hay bale, his broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his silver hair falling across his forehead. Wood shavings covered the ground around him like snow. His hands rested on his knees, swollen and red from hours of work, the knuckles raw. On the workbench in front of him sat the most beautiful thing Aurelia had ever seen. A jewelry box carved from cedar, every inch of it covered in intricate designs, flowers, vines, and worked into the pattern so subtle you had to look close to see it, the image of a bird breaking free from a cage. But it was the papers beside the box that made her knees weak. Legal documents written in his careful, sloping handwriting by lamplight while his arthritic hands screamed. She'd stepped closer, picked them up with shaking fingers and read words that changed everything. I, Josiah Thornton, do hereby grant Aurelia May Winters full ownership of 50% of the Thornton Ranch, including all lands, buildings, livestock, and assets, effective immediately. This grant is irrevocable and independent of our marriage contract. Furthermore, I hereby release Aurelia May Winters from any and all obligations under our marriage contract. She is free to leave at any time, with full ownership of her share of this property, and I shall have no legal or moral claim to prevent her departure or to demand any recompense. Her hands had trembled so badly the papers rattled. He'd given her half his ranch, the empire he'd built over 40 years, and he'd given her freedom to walk away. The $300 he'd paid, the contract that bound her, he'd torn it all up and replaced it with a gift that made her an equal partner instead of purchased property. Why? The word had come out as a whisper. Josiah had looked up slowly, and in the morning light she'd seen the exhaustion in his face, the redness around his eyes that told her he'd cried himself out. Because you were right, he'd said, his voice rough as gravel. You're not property, you're a person, a young woman with dreams and a whole life ahead of her, and I'm a selfish old fool who thought he could buy companionship the way he buys cattle. He'd gestured at the papers. Those make it right. You own half this place now. You can stay and we'll figure out how to live as partners, or you can sell your half and leave with enough money to start over anywhere you want. Free. You spent the whole night, Aurelia's voice had broken. Your hands are bleeding. Arthritis, he'd said simply. Had it for years. Gets worse in the cold. But I needed you to know. Needed you to have something beautiful. Something that wasn't a transaction. That box took me 6 months to make. Started it when I first sent for a bride before I knew who'd answer the advertisement. Wanted her to have something made with care, even if I couldn't give her love. Aurelia had lifted the lid of the cedar box with shaking hands. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, lay a gold ring, delicate, beautiful, clearly made for a woman's hand. Not the oversized band he'd put on her finger yesterday. This was different. That was my first wife's wedding ring, Josiah had said quietly. She died 40 years ago, along with our son. Childbirth took them both. His voice had cracked. I've worn my grief like armor ever since, pushing everyone away, building this ranch as a monument to loneliness. When my hands started failing, when I realized I was going to die alone in this house I built for a family that never was, I got desperate. Sent for a bride like a coward, thinking I could purchase what I'd spent 40 years being too broken to earn. He'd stood, towering over her even with exhaustion, bowing his shoulders. I won't blame you if you leave, Aurelia. Look at me. I'm 70 years old. My body's failing. I'm scarred inside and out from a war that ended before you were born. I've got nothing to offer a young woman except this land and a house full of ghosts. But if you stay, if you choose to stay, it won't be as property. It'll be as a partner, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to deserve that gift. Something had broken open in Aurelia's chest, a dam she didn't know she'd built. This man had bought her, yes. But then he'd given her everything, freedom, property, choice. He'd spent a freezing night carving her a symbol of liberation while his arthritic hands bled. He'd wept not because he'd been denied what he'd paid for, but because he'd seen her pain and recognized his own selfishness. She'd looked down at the papers, at the jewelry box, at the ring that represented a love so deep he'd carried it for 40 years. Then she'd looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not at his age or his scars or the transaction that had brought her here, at him, at the man who'd walked away from his wedding night to give her peace, who'd sacrificed comfort for her dignity, who'd literally carved freedom with bleeding hands. "Teach me," she'd whispered, setting the papers down carefully. "Show me who you are, why you did this, what happened to you that made you build walls 40 years high." She'd stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I don't want to leave, Josiah. I want to understand." His storm-gray eyes had widened. "You're young. I could run back to Missouri and end up in that brothel anyway when the money runs out," she'd interrupted. "Or I could stay here with a man who just gave me more respect in one night than every other man in my life combined." She'd reached for his swollen hands, gasping at how hot they were, how the joints were inflamed and angry. "Let me help you. My mother taught me remedies before she died, herbs that ease pain." "Your mother was from Santa Fe," Aurelia had said, lifting her chin. "Mexican, like me. She taught me healing before my father's drinking killed her spirit." She'd met his eyes. "I saw how the town looked at me yesterday, how your ranch hands stared. They think you bought yourself an exotic pet, someone beneath you." "You're not beneath anyone," Josiah had growled, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice had sent heat through her body. "Anyone who thinks, then show me," she'd challenged. "Show me I'm not property, not a pet, not a transaction. Show me why a man who could have just taken what he paid for chose to bleed in a barn instead." She'd stepped closer, close enough to smell the cedar and leather and exhaustion on him. "Teach me about you, Josiah Thornton, and maybe I'll teach you about me." He'd stared at her like she was a miracle he couldn't trust, his scarred hands trembling in hers. Maybe we both deserve better than what life gave us," she'd whispered. "Maybe that's why we're here." And that's when she'd done it, sunk to her knees in the dusty barn floor, her white wedding dress spreading around her like a flower, her hands reaching for his belt. Not from obligation, but from a desperate need to show him she was choosing this, choosing him, claiming what he'd been too honorable to take. "Wait," Josiah's voice had cracked like thunder, his massive hands catching hers before she could unbuckle his belt. "Aurelia, stop, not like this." He'd pulled her to her feet with a gentleness that shouldn't have been possible from hands that large, that scarred. "Not on your knees, not as some kind of payment or gratitude. That's not what I want from you." "Then what do you want?" She'd searched his face, confused and aching and feeling something dangerous